I'll just roll with it. So thank you for having me. This is great to be here. This is not my first time in Singapore, and I was trying to remember when was the first time I came, and I actually came here for IZEA, which was a meeting of Asian organizations that work in electronic arts. And that was in 2008. And I can see from this event and other events and all the art schools and design schools that Singapore now has that things have really moved on. And to a degree, that puts me in a situation of actually feeling a little bit like I don't really know what I'm talking about when I'm going to talk to you, because you know your context much better than I can. I am simply a visitor. If that, a really terrible visitor, because I'm only spending a few days. And so I hope that you can take what I will be talking about with a pinch of salt, really, because I'm more interested in what you might have to share with me after this, and whether it's on Twitter or otherwise, than what I can bring to you. I think I can bring perhaps some insight, but very little else. So a little bit about my background. I studied product design and interaction design, which is the meeting of industrial processes with the web and technologies. I ended up being the first UK distributor of the Arduino platform. Who here has heard of Arduino? Raise your hands. And keep your hand up if you've actually made something with it. Okay, that's 4 people. Great, thank you. This happens a lot. This is getting worse, actually, and I will talk about that, actually, because I think this is very important. I have a product that I've also made called the Goodnight Lamp, which is a connected product, and I have a consultancy called Design Swarm. So I kind of know as much about the future, and Signals of Tomorrow kind of puts a lot of pressure on my shoulders to come up with stuff that might be relevant to you, and again, I'm not sure that I have all the answers. But what I do when I come into a different city is, of course, I will talk to the cab drivers, because that's usually my insight into the local communities. If they can talk to me about the cities that they live in, I'll probably learn something that I didn't know. And what I was struck by yesterday, actually, coming in from the airport, is the amount of fog at the minute in Singapore. And it was described to me as actually, and again, I don't know whether this is true, whether this is cabbie talk, There's a lot of embellishment that happens with cab drivers sometimes because they want to impress someone. But it was described to me as the reason for this was that the neighbors are basically burning their forest to plant palm trees, because palm trees and palm oil is very desirable on the market, and so they're burning forests, and all the smog comes into Singapore. And I just thought, wow, this is incredible, because I'm about to speak at a conference where I'm being, told that there's a big program of a smart nation, and in a way, the problem is not the smart nation; it's the neighbors of the smart nation. And that's kind of, it's kind of an interesting conundrum in a way, because your policy and what you can operate on and the decisions that you can make as a city, as a country, does not mean that you are not constantly being influenced by the people around you and the decision-making that they make. So in as much as we can plan for certain things to happen, the world is a complicated place, and a complicated place of many dynamics. And everybody's got a neighbor. And I think that making suffers a little bit from that. I think that making thinks that it's an island. And makers, and of course what I understand as makers is from my own experience of working with the Arduino platform, selling it, running workshops. Making is actually not really isolated at all from the rest of consumer dynamics and consumerism, really. A lot of you bought an Arduino. Only 3 of you made something with it. So you bought something, you spent some money on an idea, on the idea that you might have the time to do something with this thing, and the reality that you didn't, that it's probably sat in a drawer somewhere, or you probably gave it to a friend or put it on eBay or whatever it is. And I don't think that we can shy away from that reality, that we are really, in a way, making is also leading to consuming and consumerism. And excuse the Francis Bacon painting, but this is a reality that we live in, and I think that part of the that is part of our future challenges for ourselves. We don't really like thinking about the things that we can't have. We like thinking about the things that we really want to have. But I think a lot of the challenges that also the speakers were talking about previously are things that are linked to the things that we probably shouldn't have, and the behavior change that we probably should be going through. And whenever we think about behavior change, as we also discussed earlier, you know, it's sort of like, oh, I know, it's like your mom telling you what to do when you're a kid. You sort of go like, ugh, you know I should be eating more green vegetables and brushing my teeth for 3 minutes, but you don't do it. You just sort of avoid the whole thing. And in the UK, you have the context of the expression of a nanny state. And behavioral change is really the return of a nanny world, really, a world where we actually we should stop doing certain things. And again, what's the kind of link to making? Well, I think the link to making is a really interesting one, because when people talk about making, they also possibly talk about selling and talk about making things at a large enough scale to be successful and to have success. And that is, you know, again, we have to be clear about what we mean. That is putting things out into the world that people may or may not use, may or may not discard ethically, may or may not even build ethically. But we champion this idea of invention, and we champion the story of being able to prototype anything and make anything constantly. And, you know, it's hiding behind the platforms that enable us to do these things much more quickly and much more cheaply than we ever had access to. So beforehand, you know, I'm 34. I studied design in the early 2000s. You needed an education in order to do this kind of work. You needed to sort of toil away, get a bank loan, study for years, and then maybe you might get a sense of what it would be like to make something into the world and make thousands of something. And right now, if you took someone who had no knowledge of product design whatsoever, they could probably make something and put something out into the world in a couple of months, and Googling their way through with access to crowdfunding and get all their friends on it and give them a bit of money, and then they have it there. It doesn't mean that that's less valuable, because that's incredible access and incredible democratic access to things that cost me a lot of money, but in a way I should have waited, and it would have spared me the 10 years of paying back a bank loan. But these are a really change in dynamic, and a change in educational environment. Not everybody who will want to make something will think about how it might be disassembled, how it will be recycled, where it will end up. If it ends up somewhere else and it's a smart object, you know, does that object keep producing data after it's been discarded or when it changes hands? There's whole sort of environments of thinking and ways of thinking about product design that person might never need to engage with. And this story of invention is also a story that is, you know, sometimes hides a lot of failures. This is from one of the main stories in the last few months or so, which has been the closure of Quirky. And this was the image that they used to promote the website Success Stories. It's a lot of white men. And you know, they closed down the business after several years because it turns out that manufacturing and distribution is really difficult. It's like, yes, we knew this, but it didn't fit the story to admit that, and it didn't fit the story because it was about invention, about supporting invention. And worse is you end up with sort of lies embedded in all of this. So I discovered this recently, that MakerBot, which is the formerly open 3D printing company, may or may not have lied to its investors about the efficiency of one of its components when it's sold to the investors, and now they're being sued and the founders are being sued. And so the story of invention and open access and open source technologies and 3D printing taking over the world is really faced with actually some quite dramatic realities, business realities, and the realities of consumerism and a drive for growth, a constant drive for growth. So if making is sort of fraught and a fraught process, where does it really belong? I think there's a really great place for making, which is in actually quite different projects, and projects that actually don't do well in a capitalist society. Areas where politicians just won't go at all. And this is the Japan Geiger maps, which was a project where the Japanese government wasn't very open to publishing the data around Fukushima. So a small group of people took a sort of open approach to building a smart Geiger counter. So you would go out, get a Geiger counter, connect it up to the web, and this project would show you what the reading was in your local environment. And so it forced local politicians to be very transparent about something they had no interest in being transparent about. And that's where making comes in and kind of exposes things that are hidden away that you really shouldn't be hidden away. And sometimes, you know, making happens at such a small scale, it feels like it is unsustainable, really, from an industrial standpoint, but actually it's really important because you're only capturing information about very small number of things, because the small number of things are bears or polar bears or lions or whatever, and they're being tracked, and there's only 24 left in the world, and so you've got to track the 24 left in the world. And those projects are really badly funded. The technology they have needs to be very robust, but they only need 24 of something. And so this is where open access and open source technologies and an open sense of making and collaboration really comes into play and really you know, gets to be amazing. And those projects need all the help they can get. And also opening up markets that are really slow or just a little bit antiquated in their processes. So open prosthetics, and you might have seen that the 3D printing world has really been taken over at the minute by prosthetics projects. So people making 3D printed limbs, because actually getting a normal prosthetic is just you know, it's expensive, it's a long process, the hospitals don't really want to get involved anyway, it's sort of outsourced to whoever. It's a very long, difficult process. And when you're talking about maybe children needing those solutions, the children are growing all the time. They need different versions all the time, different sizes all the time. So Project Andiamo, which is on the right-hand side, is a London-based project, and they do 3D printing for braces for children who are disabled, because again, the brace size needs to change all the time. And so when we have these projects that are smaller, that are more agile, that are possibly supported more heavily by the government, for example, we also have to think about where those projects are kind of coming from. This is a US project called Clicker, with a Q. I've got slides up online if you want to. And they are making, you know, something quite sort of first world problem kind of thing of needing access to your music library by having these pads on the wall, and you touch a pad and then a song plays. Something very, very, you know, non-essential to life, but quite nice. They are manufacturing the wooden pieces in France, and they're in the US. I'm pretty sure there's lots and lots of, you know, wood in the US. But the only people who would do it or the only people they could find who would do it at their specifications is in France. And so the wooden pieces out of all the electronics are coming in from China, most probably. Everything is sort of coming from all these different places in the world to make a batch of 500 or something. And that's sort of ludicrous. Why wouldn't they be able to be helped to make something locally and to make something in their state, in their country, to kind of keep everything local, because it's going to be better for the environment? I'm pretty sure that getting a bunch of wood out from France to the US is not the best way of doing it. And it's going to get them to meet local industry who is probably struggling to keep up with everybody, because everybody's manufacturing environment is just struggling generally. So what's the role of the city? There's a lot of city stakeholders here today, and I think that there's a really great role, which is yes, education and engagement of citizens. I would hate for that to really only ever mean data platforms. I think that in smart city discourse, there's a propensity to go towards a data platform as being the thing that resolves all the problem. I think actually engaging deeply and truly with people to enable them to have behavioral change is the biggest challenge you will ever face, technology or otherwise. I think focusing on areas that are not necessarily urban is also interesting. The food that we consume often does not come from large cities. It comes from the middle of the ocean or fields or mountains somewhere, or the neighbors who are burning half their forest away. And engaging with a rural to urban type of project is actually quite interesting. There's a little bit of work being done in that space, but I think not enough, and I think it needs more government support. A lot of those jobs are disappearing because people simply don't want to be farmers anymore. And so where will our food come from? We still have to eat, and we still really like to eat things that are grown very far away. And I think that we also have to teach the corporations that we engage with as cities and city stakeholders into being better citizens themselves. So we can ask a lot of citizens, but we have to ask a lot out of big businesses. And this is an idea that I've had about a visual language that you would put on any object that was a connected object. Because really, we should ask our corporations to tell us how they're using our data, what technologies is embedded in it, and give us mechanisms as consumers to choose the right things and make better choices. We cannot make better choices when we're completely left in the dark and we're just sold stuff constantly. And finally, to support this openness, to support open source projects and actively support it, whether it's through incubators and local incubators, but for the ROI of a particular project not to be growth and, you know, a unicorn. Sometimes it can be 24 or 8 or 10 really well-made open things that contribute to the city in very meaningful ways, but will never become a large corporation. And that's precisely where it should sit. But it should be something that the city actively promotes. Because really, I think what we've run out of ideas from the 1950s. The post-war era was very good for us in terms of elation and imagery, but I think we need to move away from that and come up with new ideas, new visions for ourselves, and new visuals. Thank you very much.